Welcome, everybody, to the Illusion of Consensus podcast. I am delighted to have here with me my good friend, Christiaan von Geusau, who was the former president of the ITI Catholic University in Vienna. And he is a fantastic scholar of the law, as well as someone who was quite active in advocating for sanity during the COVID pandemic. Christiaan, thank you for coming on the show, and thank you for talking with me.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Jay, and I'm happy that I'm now looking into your office, which I have to visit soon.
I'm looking forward to that someday. Although we have had a chance to meet a few times during the pandemic, hopefully we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about some of those meetings. But the reason I asked you to come on this podcast is I wanted to have our listeners hear your perspective on what the COVID response in Europe was like from the perspective of a university president, and also from the perspective of a legal scholar. We're going to talk about both. But I want to start the first half of the podcast with that, and then the second half we'll talk about censorship in Europe and what that really what there's like a deep meaning I think you have, and you've told me about that. So I want the audience to hear that theory, those ideas. So why don't we start, Christiaan, by why don't you tell us about you're now retired as university president. What was your role during the pandemic? How long had you been president before at this ITI Catholic University, one of the top Catholic universities in Europe?
Well, I was with ITI Catholic University for almost 20 years. I have retired from my function as president, but I have certainly not retired as an active worker, or whatever way you call it. It was thanks to term limits, in fact, that I reintroduced into the statutes of the university. I had to step down after almost 10 years as president. Before that, I was 10 years general counsel and vice president for development. So I was able to live through an important chunk of the history of this vibrant Catholic university at the heart of Europe, a private university. But coming to your question as to the COVID response and the COVID times, I fell right in the middle of it, of course. And what we experienced, giving you a short answer to your first two questions, how was it in Europe, both as a university president and in general, the whole situation, also from a legal, philosophical perspective, I would say it was terrible in both respects. In fact, I was reflecting recently on it, preparing for this podcast with you, Jay. I can easily say that in my life, I am now 52. In my life, this period of COVID lockdowns and everything that followed it was for me certainly the darkest period of my life, because what we saw happening there, especially in the way humans treated other humans, goes beyond my comprehension still today. I've been trying to analyze it, and I'm sure we'll come to talk more about it. I would also say that although I am not Austrian, I'm Dutch, although I was born in the United States, so I'm a dual Dutch-American citizen. But I've lived in Austria, this very beautiful country, for 20 years because of the university. And I would say there's a big difference in which European country you were during the pandemic. And I would say generally, there's a chunk of countries where it was particularly bad. And I'm not speaking so much about the pandemic itself, but the response to it by governments. And I would say Austria certainly belonged to the countries in Europe where that was particularly harsh and bad, that response, along with Germany, Italy, and Spain. Those were really the countries where people suffered the most from the government measures, and where they also went furthest.
I mean, certainly there was quite a bit of diversity across Europe, with Sweden having the sort of the least, I think, draconian response to the pandemic, but then right next door, Germany having among the most draconian. Austria, of course, had a lot of the policies that I opposed, and I know you did, on vaccine mandates and passports and ostracization of people who didn't comply with the lockdown orders.
I think one of the worst things in Austria was what they called the lockdown for the unvaccinated. That, I think, was one of the worst things that they could have thought of, to do that, because in that way, a certain part of the population was basically treated as lesser than human in the sense of how they were treated. I mean, just imagine that the unvaccinated were not allowed to go into restaurants, were not allowed to go into shops, were basically not allowed to participate in social life whatsoever. And I think, and that's just one of the examples.
I mean, the government essentially embraced.
No, in Italy, for example, there are also terrible examples. I mean, there in the lockdowns, this is what few people know, you would have the police and also police helicopters actually checking if people went out of their houses and even if they went into their gardens. I have friends of ours who actually experienced that. I could speak for hours about this. I will not bore you with that, but there was quite a difference. For example, my own home country, the Netherlands, although it also had some bad phases, was certainly not as bad as Austria or Italy or Germany.
I mean, there were snitch lines. There were aspects of the COVID response that I think that I never thought I would see in free countries. That were adopted throughout Europe and actually the United States and much of the rest of the world as well. But as you said, there's tremendous diversity across Europe. So I'm going to explore that. I think, but before we get to that, I wanted to focus in on your role as university president, because I what I saw in my own university, but also in universities around the world where friends of mine worked, was tremendous pressure on university scholars that had a sort of a heterodox approach, or a sort of a approach that was contrary to the sort of the public health mantra. The notion of academic freedom, the idea that university professors should be allowed within the bounds of the law to say wherever their ideas lead them. That seemed to me, within university after university that had previously embraced it, thrown aside, with including professors being fired over their views. As a university president, Christiaan, I'd love to hear your perspective on how did that come to pass, and what pressures did you face within the university? Because it seems so universal that it was such a refreshing thing to see it not happen. Right? I know at your university you worked very hard against that to allow the professors to have their say. Can you speak about the pressures that university presidents and universities leadership faced, such that they would leave aside basic ideas like academic freedom, which I view as fundamental to the well-functioning of universities?
Well, I think the most important reason for that, and I think in that university presidents were not different than other citizens or other people in leadership positions, there was this climate of fear that was being created. And we'll probably come to speak about that a little bit later, about the German RKI files, where it is now completely come out that fear was actually deliberately created. We're not surprised to hear that, of course, but it's now also a proven fact and not a conspiracy theory anymore. And so I think everybody was very much affected by this fear. And everybody, and to a certain extent, one can understand that, everybody was afraid that they would contribute somehow to the spread if they would not take measures. And if you take that together with the messaging that was coming from government actors, that these measures had to be followed, if not, you were the one who was responsible for killing your grandma, the infamous line that was always used. So people were really scared that they would be the one who could be held accountable for somebody's death, because this climate of fear was being created. And of course, to some extent, fear could be justified in certain circumstances, but obviously fear has never been a good counsel, especially where it comes to public policy. So I think that's one thing that I would say is at the forefront in answering your question, at the forefront also what university presidents were dealing with. And if you couple that with the messaging that came from the government also through policies, I still remember the unclarity when the first lockdown was announced in March 2020. The unclarity there was as to whether the government instructions or publications regarding lockdowns were actually legally binding on universities to close or not to close. That was very vague because, of course, there wasn't much of a real strong legal basis for shutting down society altogether. And so I really think that's most of the answer. Of course, other university presidents, our university is a private university, so we and not beholden to certain companies or certain organizations. So, of course, in our position, we were in a little bit of an easier position. We were also not a government funded university. And I think many presidents of government-funded universities were probably also afraid that they would probably lose government funding if they would not go ahead with this. But so I would say that my university was certainly in an advantageous position because we had more wiggle room. But I have to say we were the only university who used that wiggle room. Because, as you mentioned earlier, after I will never forget that image, Jay. And you know, we're both professors, so we love our students. And I will never forget the image in the second or third week of lockdown. We had just March 2020. We had just sent our students home because we thought that's what the government told us to do. And I will never forget one image of one student who I was teaching a class online. And I had on my screen, you know, all these students. And there was one student sitting in a dark garage with behind him boxes and tools and everything. And he looked so miserable, that student. And that's the moment I realized, no, we are doing something so wrong. We are doing such injustice to these students. I am not going to go along with this any longer. And so I actually briefly after that got together my leadership team and I said, guys, we have to find a way that we're going to stop this madness, because I see how we are destroying the lives of young people. And we can't, as president, as long as I'm president, I cannot be responsible for that. So what we did is we actually went to research a little bit. And actually we found out that because we are a private university, the government could not impose a lockdown on our university. So what I did is I actually took the direct approach. I actually approached the local health authorities and I went to sit down with them. And this was the end of April, so just before the first lockdown ended. So we had already been in lockdown for like 6, 7, 8 weeks or something. And I sat down with the local health authorities and I said, listen, guys, we are a university with their own campus. Yeah? I am willing here to guarantee you that I will tell my students that for now, it is in their own interest that they stay on campus, because under that condition, I can keep the campus open and I keep in-person education open. And since all students live on campus and our professors are in the vicinities who could travel to campus, I said to the health authorities, if you let me keep my university open, I will make sure that our students are disciplined. And they went along with that. And we did that all officially, in writing. And that led to the fact that since May 2020, we never participated in any more of the lockdowns. Whilst all other universities in the country and in the region went into lockdown number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, I don't know, I lost count. We always remained open after that first lockdown. And we also did not have a mask mandate. We did not do vaccine mandates. We didn't do any mandates. We just appealed to people to use common sense, that if they're sick, they stay at home, just the usual common sense things. And we didn't have any major outbreaks or any of those sorts of issues. Yeah, sometimes somebody caught it and maybe 2, 3 other people caught it, but there were no major incidents. And our students just continue to have, under the circumstances, a normal student life.
I'm really curious about what led someone like you, Christiaan, to make such a brave decision, because it was brave at the time. I mean, as you so movingly described, the pressure that people in leadership faced based on this intentional program of fear that the government had embraced. And I can think of a few alternative explanations, and I'd love your reaction. On one hand, you could be reacting to what the epidemiological data actually were showing, right? So children and young people were at much, much, much lower risk than older people, and so disrupting the lives of young people made very little sense if you took into account the harm done to them from doing that. So that's sort of an epidemiological cost benefit kind of benefit harm kind of idea, where maybe you protect older workers better. I mean, that's some kind of a scientific approach. Mm-hmm. I've also seen some of your writing, Christiaan. You write very movingly about the importance of beauty in the in providing education, like true, real education. And when you describe the circumstances of a young man sitting in a garage, surrounded by in the dark, surrounded by boxes, I wonder how good can you do? How well can you learn? How easily can you learn? Is that environment conducive to learning, especially when you're sitting there all alone, with no capacity to go talk to other professors or your fellow students about ideas that you're having? So there's the second thing could be philosophical basis for opposition to the lockdowns, and of course the third is you were the president of a Catholic university, that there's potentially the idea that there's more to life than just simply like our physical day to day. And mere survival, that we have a purpose. I mean, that's sort of central to Christian and Catholic ideas, I think. So that could be a third explanation. And then yet a fourth you provided is that you're a private university, so you have the capacity to say no to the government. What did any? I mean, I suspect I know some of your answer, but I'm really curious. How much of these four possible reasons, scientific ideas, philosophical commitments, religious commitments, and then the independence from the government, how much of those four did it play in your decision making and your capacity to say no? And why didn't other folks in your situation, in similarly situated, say no in the way you did?
Well, Jay, I would say all of the above, and let me just briefly touch upon each one of them. Let's start with the last one. Actually, let's start with the first one, because obviously I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not even a medical scientist, so it's not up to me to judge on these issues lightly. But I did keep very close track of the literature, because already from the beginning, my gut feeling told me that there was something amiss in the way our society was dealing with this. And I learned that from my father, in fact. It's one of the greatest lessons I learned from my father, who's a professor of law, retired now. But my father has always taught us, when you try to understand something that's going on in the world, in the news, always look at various different sources. Don't base your judgment on one source only, or on one political direction only. So I've always learned, and of course on top of that you learn that as a lawyer as well, to just look into different sources. So already from the beginning of this whole crisis, I thought there's something amiss here, there's something missing here. So I started researching more and more, and on the basis of that, I could come on the basis of my responsibilities to the judgment that the actions I was about to take were responsible. In fact, weighing all the options was the responsible thing to do, because I knew that I could create an environment at our university where it was safe and where I could allow our students to do that for which they were actually there. I will actually tell you honestly, Jay, now looking back, I even regret that we went along with the first lockdown. I even regret that. But at least we corrected our course, and 6 to 8 weeks later we changed course. So that's the first one. The second one, what was your second one again?
The second one is this. I mean, you wrote about this commitment to beauty
Exactly.
In the importance of beauty in education, in this beautiful settings, in promoting education. Actually, more broadly, I think that second one is you have a mission as a university to educate,
Right.
and so many universities decided that was going to be a secondary consideration during the pandemic. That fundamental mission could be put to the wayside and dropped in part because of the pandemic.
Yes, and at our university, a special mission has always been to create for the students an environment that is conducive to true learning. And that environment needs to be an environment that inspires, that is inspired by beauty. So that is the building, that is the nature, that is the way we appoint a building. That has always been a very important mark, because if we are, stay with the example of the garage. If you are in an ugly garage surrounded by boxes and tools, no matter how important those boxes and tools might be, that's not an environment conducive to learning and to growing as a human being. And that's what we want that students do at our universities. We want their characters to develop. We want them to grow as human beings.
I mean,
and you cannot do that from a garage.
You can imagine, like, if they're learning to repair a car, the garage is the right place to do this. But they're learning things that require them to be in community with other people, other professors, with other students, exchanging ideas, isolated and alone in an environment that's apart from everybody seems like a very bad way to teach the kinds of things your university has a mission to teach.
No, and especially our university has that mission. And if I look back at my own student time, the most important I learned in my student years was through the interaction with other human beings, through living in a community of students, through dealing with all the struggles and all the joys and everything that comes with that. And we were actually taking that away from young people. And so that was a second reason for me, very obvious, that was not going to work with our specific university.
But Christiaan, why did so many other universities fail at that? Like, why did they? Is it? I mean, to me, it was quite disappointing that my own university didn't see that they were not providing the education that is the central part of our mission to the students, for years, right? And I think it's hard to unsee that as someone that really deeply believes in the educational mission of the universities. So is it really truly our mission? Like, what is the purpose of a university if it is not to teach the students that come before us?
Well, I think this is a problem, is that we have been losing in our technocratic society. We have been losing our understanding of what is the meaning of education. It has become increasingly focused on acquiring skills and preparing people for the market, to become good consumers and to become good producers. But we've actually forgotten what is the real meaning of education. And education is first and foremost to form the hearts and the minds of young people, to learn them how to think, to learn them how to debate. Actually, and you see that in our snowflake generation, how young people are increasingly incapable of actually debating an opponent about a topic that they hold very strong opinions on. And we need to, today we need safe zones to actually protect people against opinions that they don't like. That shows that we have miserably failed in our education. Because if we cannot teach people anymore how to think for themselves, how to have a civilized debate with another about a topic, how to dig into it, how to share with others, how to live in community, then we're failing. And so I think many of our universities, also due to corporatism, of course, to the massive financial interests that are often playing at the background, which makes universities often also very unfree. I think many universities have completely lost sight of what is the meaning of education and what it is there for. Education is not primarily there to just get you a paper and get you a job. If that's what you think where university of education is about, then you really have missed the boat on what it really is. Because once again, especially university education, but also the years before that, is about forming the human being to allow that human being to think for him or herself, to learn how to deal with reality, to learn how to deal with my fellow human beings, and then increasingly, as I specialize, do that in an area where I'm talented, where I'm interested, and where I'm trying to better understand that reality.
I mean, that's beautiful. And I wish more universities had maintained that commitment. I mean, that every university worthy of note has that commitment to education. But it was heartbreaking to watch so many fail at that during the pandemic. Okay, so the third idea was a potential reason why you were able to stay open was you're a Catholic university, right, and being a Catholic university, and being a Christian, I mean, there are purposes that we have that are beyond just our physical safety, right? That it's the mission is not just a secular mission for your university, but also a religious conviction. What role did those ideas play, and what role did I mean, I don't know, actually, Christian, I confess ignorance about this. I don't know what role the Catholic Church plays in the way that Catholic universities run. How did those religious connections impact your ability to stay open?
Hi everyone, a quick recommendation. I just saw a great film on YouTube called Medicating Normal. It's about the growing trend to medicate mental distress with powerful psychiatric drugs like Prozac, Xanax, Seroquel, and Adderall. For some people, once on these drugs, they're almost impossible to get off, and they have devastating side effects. The film tells the story of people whose lives were ruined by taking these common prescriptions. Watch a trailer and the award-winning film on medicatingnormal.com. That's Medicating Normal, medicating with an ing at the end, normal.com. Our show notes and newsletter will have information on how to find the film. There's also a YouTube channel. Don't miss it. Check out the link in the description below. Thanks.
Well, I think the most important dimension of any institution of Catholic education is, or should be, that we first and foremost look at the individual person and how that person can grow closer to God, and how that person can find his or her true vocation in life. And that basically what the educational institution wants to do is to accompany that person in this process in finding that. And so what Catholic education really does, it looks at the whole person. It doesn't just look at, what competencies does this person have and where can we place them in the market? No. The Catholic education, the Catholic institution looks at the whole person, mind, body, and soul, and wants to allow those to develop in concert. So, at a Catholic institution of higher learning, you have all these things that should be taken care of. So you have the spiritual life, you have the physical life, sports facilities, and everything that comes with it. And you have the intellectual life. Yeah? But you also have the social community life. This is such an important aspect. In fact, that's what many students told me afterwards when this was over. They said that they were so grateful that we remained open, because society was closed, but at least here at the university, they still had the opportunity to have a social life, to interact with each other. We shouldn't forget how vitally important that is at this age, how this shapes your life at this age. So since Catholic institutions of learning look at the whole person, we also have the duty to look at all these aspects and to make sure that, especially I would say in times of crisis, these aspects actually come to fruition and they can actually find support in that. I'll tell you a funny story. One day we got the regulation from the Austrian Bishops' Conference that it was only allowed, this was for the whole country, to have holy masses take place with 10 people or less. Let's leave apart, the assessment of that, but that's just how it was. And so I sat down with all the priests that we had working on our campus, and I said, okay, how many of our students want to go to daily mass? Now divide that by groups of 10. Please organize throughout the campus as many masses per day at different locations to keep it safe, at different locations with 10 people. So there was indeed a certain period that every day we had 10 holy masses at different places on campus. Just to illustrate to you how important this is for a Catholic university, that we also take care of the soul, that we also take care of the spiritual life. But also, and this is a more practical point, you could be creative in these times. It was possible to be creative. And that's another thing I have so often missed during these times. Why were people not more creative?
There was a church in San Diego, a Protestant church in San Diego during at some point during the pandemic. A regulation had been put down. I think it was actually from the state, but maybe it was from the county. That the churches must stay closed. You could not hold church services, but strip clubs could stay open. You could have strip clubs.
Yeah.
So the church, one of the churches in San Diego, the pastor declared itself a strip club. Declare the church a strip club, and then he shows up on YouTube taking his tie off, saying, "See, I'm stripping," and then gives this normal sermon.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that sort of creativity, but there were many possibilities. I remember, for example, there was one bishop in the United States. I can't remember who it was, who then invited people to come with their cars to the square in front of the cathedral for mass. And then he would go personally with his priest to each car and hand out communion, So there were so many ways in which we could do that. And I think we have so failed in that. We have so failed in that during this time.
But okay, so I think this is I think it's wonderful the way that you worked within the rules that the church allowed you to work within, and of course you're very creative in this. But I want to explore just a little bit the role of the church itself, right? So the church is telling you you can have mass, but you must have only 10 people. Were there other? My sense is that Christian institutions were very mixed about how they dealt with these things. Like on the one hand, there was still this sort of, when some churches and some faith communities this deep commitment to continue to participate in the life of the Spirit. That is the purpose of life according to these communities, and including within the Catholic Church. I saw that, but then there's also, what looked to me like essentially an alignment with with public health authorities, where the public health priorities often were placed above, even by church communities, above the commitment to faith, commitments of faith. What was your view of that, and how did it impact your decision making in running the university?
Well, I think to be perfectly honest, I think there was also a lot of lack of creativity on the side of many in the church, and I think in many instances much more could have been done. There were individual priests and bishops who were quite courageous and did things, but again, I think and this is something I often say in these regards. One of the most important reasons, and that's, I would honestly say, in defense of the church authorities, one of the most important reasons, I would say, is why very often creativity was also lacking there, is because there was no real support from the faithful to do so. And I'll give you an example there. I was inspired that one day there was some Italian priest, I can't remember who it was, who during the height of the pandemic went around his village with the Blessed Sacrament, simply to pray, simply to pray. And I thought that was a great idea. And so I went to our parish priest and I got our parish priests, 3 of them, to do the same with me. And there are actually still videos of that. It's quite something, because I will never forget how we went through these complete empty streets, and it was just me and the priest. And again, if I as a layperson had not come forward and suggested we do that, they probably really thought that they shouldn't be doing that. So it goes both ways. Now, I think one of the lasting disappointments of the pandemic was that, although for many people online mass or online religious services were better than nothing, which one could argue for, we have seen that many people have not returned to churches after the Zoom masses were over, so to say. In fact, there are many parishes who continue to have Zoom masses because many people have not returned. So I think we as Christians have a lot to learn from this time of the pandemic, because I think at the end of the day, we should have been more a people of hope. And I think we were too scared of death. And that also very much informed our actions. And I think that's very important, because despite, of course, all the care one has to take in such periods of time and etc., that's all perfectly understandable. At the end of the day, as Christians, you have to be people of hope in such times. And I think that's where, in general, we as Christians failed a lot.
Okay, so the fourth possibility that I raised is the fact that your university is not a government university, that you're a private university, and that gave you some leeway within the laws to make your own decisions. But even beyond that, you don't. In free countries like Austria, you don't structure the university curricula or the around what the government wants.
Right.
And yet, if you're a private university, if you have that capacity. But if you're a public university, you get most of your funding from the government, or even if you're a private university and much of your funding, for instance, comes from government sources, for instance, for research. What pressures does that place on decision making at the university, even in non-pandemic times? And what special pressures did that place on public universities during the pandemic? in
Well,
your observation?
there was certainly a lot of pressure on public universities during the pandemic. And I think that none of my colleagues at the time, my colleague rectors of other public universities, I don't think any of them even entertained the thought of choosing the route that I chose for our university, because they are government funded, and they are also, as you say, the curriculum is very much within a certain legal framework provided by the government. So I think that's absolutely clear that played a major role. But again, it was there. I mean, you've spoken about it more often, Jay. There was this general attitude, this general sense amongst also intellectuals, most people, that everybody had to stick their nose in the same direction, and that any criticism or any deviation from what the government said was absolutely non-acceptable. And I have to say, unfortunately, most university presidents went along with that, although some of them in private would say, well, I'm not sure if this is exactly the right thing. But people were so afraid to step out of line. People were so afraid to say something that was not in accordance with this specific narrative. It was quite something.
This is a good segue for a topic that I wanted your viewpoints on, and that is censorship of alternative viewpoints in Europe during the pandemic. I mean, I know a lot about the American censorship efforts. It was the official policy of the American government to use its power over social media companies to suppress and denigrate ideas that contradicted government policy. I mean, that's something that I never thought would happen could happen in free countries, but yet it happened all throughout the pandemic in the United States, and I noticed also in Europe the same very, very similar kinds of policies. Could you please describe, Christiaan, what was from your perspective? What was that? What was that like? What were the legal structures that permitted that to happen? And what can be done to address it now that the pandemic has come to a close?
Well, I think first of all, the censorship in Europe was as bad as in the United States, and continues to be so in certain respects. Let's not forget that. So I think that's a clear situation, and the legal framework for that. It's, by the way, interesting. Very, very often when people compare the censorship that has taken place in Corona times, and by the way, I still remember when I would say this in an article or on a podcast maybe 2.5 years ago, people would say, no, you're exaggerating. This is conspiracy theory. Well, we know by now, of course, at the latest, after the letter of Mark Zuckerberg to the United States Congress, we know, of course, that it was all true and that it was not a conspiracy theory, but that it was reality, that this censorship was taking place. And of course, we most of all know it from your case before the Supreme Court, from all the court documents. So there's no doubt anymore that there was censorship. Now, the legal framework in Europe is as murky as it is in the United States, where, of course, in the United States, very often people say, well, we have, at least in the United States, have the First Amendment. But in Europe, we also have a sort of First Amendment, because in the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 10, we have a complete free speech protection, which is also repeated in Article 11 of the EU Charter on Fundamental Rights. It's all there, it's all there. There's no question it's there. And then, of course, in almost every constitution of every European country, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, it's all there. So the basis on which we could say that it should not happen censorship is there. The legal framework, very much depending from country to country, but I would say most of it was not legally based at all. It was simply governments or social media companies simply acting upon some sort of vague description of emergency through which it was then censored what was censored. And by the way, it's very interesting to see now that with this famous RKI files, so the Robert Koch Institute is the equivalent of the CDC in the United States. Huh?
It's funny because Americans would say RKI just for Americans listening.
Yeah,
RKI
exactly.
files.
RKI, exactly. And so those files, which basically give the minutes of all the meetings they have had in the Corona pandemic, they basically spill the beans on it all. And although they don't necessarily speak about the censorship we are speaking about, it tells us a lot about the operation that was going on, which basically, and that's the interesting thing in these files, is that we always were told that we have to follow the science and that the politicians are simply following the science. Well, from the Robert Koch Institute files, it becomes abundantly clear that it was the other way around. That actually the scientists at the Robert Koch Institute expressed doubt on every single measure that was proposed, from lockdowns to masks to vaccination of children, you name it. It was every single one they doubted. But it was the politicians who intervened and said, no, we want this differently. We're going to do this differently. Now, why do I mention this in relation to your question of censorship? Because I've actually identified, also I've been writing a couple of articles about this as well. I've identified three sorts of censorship that are going on. There is the hard censorship that, for example, you are dealing with in the Missouri case, in the Murthy versus Missouri case, where you just have clear evidence of actually a government institution telling somebody or some institution to take away certain information because it doesn't like it. That's the sort of hard censorship. Then you have as a second form, which is equally problematic, and that you see that very much in the RKI files, is what I call indirect censorship. And that is basically the government withholding information from the public because it doesn't align with its political purposes. And if the RKI files show one thing, that's what the German government did. It actively withheld certain information that its own scientists thought was important because it didn't align with certain political ends. And then the third way of sort of censorship is self-censorship. And I think we've all experienced that, Once you understand that if you say this or that, you can get into trouble, you start being more careful and you start not saying certain things anymore. So all these three ways of censorship are there, and the mechanisms that are used for it in Europe have not been much different as they have been in the United States. In fact, I think it was also in your Supreme Court case that became clear that the way, for example, the EU has been operating in this is very similar to the way in which the United States government was operating in this.
I mean, there are the EU regulations like the Digital
Service Act, yes,
Services Act, which I think give some formal powers to the EU to pressure social media companies. It was interesting. We're recording today is the 16th of September, 2024. It's a day when a high EU commissioner named Thierry Breton has resigned, and he became famous. At least that came to my attention during the right before when Elon Musk was going to interview the former President Trump. I think earlier this month on Elon Musk's X platform, tens of millions of people tuned in. Before that interview had even occurred, Thierry Breton of the EU wrote a letter instructing Elon Musk to be very careful about what he would ask Donald Trump, as if some High Commissioner of the EU should have some power over a one person interviewing a presidential candidate in the country where he lives. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense if you believe in free speech, and yet there you have this. You have essentially what looks like the power of the EU trying to suppress American free speech.
Well, actually, the Digital Service Act has some very problematic elements in it, and this Euro Commissar was actually making full use of that also with this letter to Musk, because one of the provisions in the EU Digital Service Act is that major social media platforms, they call them very large platforms, are actually required to apply due diligence in making sure no content is spread on their platform that the EU through this regulation might find problematic. Now, there are, of course, certain justified content that is problematic, like calls to violence or anti-Semitism, or, there are certain areas that are problematic and that obviously such a platform has to deal with. But it also refers, for example, to public health information. Explicitly, it also refers to that. Now, you just think of how censorship took place during the corona pandemic and how valid scientific information was being withheld. This act actually gives the legal framework to be able to do that. And that's where Breton was actually referring to in his letter to Musk, because there's also the other vague term of misinformation and disinformation. It's not actually defined in the EU Digital Service Act what that is, which basically means that either the European Commission or the so-called digital services coordinators in the individual member state get to decide what mis and disinformation is. That's the legal framework you were asking about. It. That's the legal framework that is now in full force and effect in the European Union. And let my friends in the United States have no illusions about it. The United States is fully impacted by that, because the EU Digital Services Act gives itself the power to intervene whenever it concerns information that affects Europe. Hence also Breton's letter to Musk saying that, suggesting that, possibly an interview of you with Trump can lead to whatever in Europe, So it actually also affects the United States. And as we have seen more often in the past, such examples of how the EU does things are often followed by other countries, including the United States. So in fact, the EU Digital Services Act has a direct impact on free speech in the United States and by United States social media companies, which is, of course, also the reason why Elon Musk is having such a public fight with the European Commission on that.
It's really important that you brought up the RKI files in the context of the censorship, because the fact is that the government spread misinformation during the pandemic in very harmful ways. They spread false characterizations of what the scientific evidence on topic after topic after topic were saying. Immunity after COVID recovery, the literature on the efficacy of mask mandates or masks, the literature on the impacts and harms of lockdowns. On topic after topic, the government spread misinformation. And then they use their censorship powers to suppress the criticism of the government's spread of misinformation in the guise of suppressing misinformation. It's a very, very dangerous thing. And the RKI files show that the government even went so far as to order government scientists or pressure government scientists to not share true scientific information simply because it contradicted government policy. That's a very dangerous place. I mean, it's not to my mind, what a normal liberal democracy looks like. Like a normal liberal democracy has a very, very wide private sphere for conversation and thought and discussion and for speech. And yet we have now in place laws in Europe, in the US, in the UK, in Australia, in Canada, all over the world. Essentially, the government has taken on itself the power to suppress private citizens from speaking in ways that criticize them, even when the government is saying inaccurate, false things.
Yeah, and it's not only dangerous. I would say it's even scary to see that, because it shows that from within, the big threat to our democracy. We always like to focus on how it comes from without, and yes, there are major threats coming from without, but we equally have massive threats to our democracy coming from within. And there's actually an interesting point that I've delved into that question a little bit deeper. How have we come there? How have we landed at this point? And I was actually a few days ago reading a very interesting article by a British writer. His name is David McGrogan, and he has a very interesting analysis of this problem, because basically what he says in his article on this, he says, we have come to a point where our government takes upon itself the task to govern our souls. And he says, we should not so much focus this debate around censorship on the problem of that our freedom of speech is harmed, because yes, he says that is a problem, but he says it goes much deeper than that. And that he connects that to the secularization of society, because he says since society is so secularized, basically since there is no transcendence anymore, the state has taken over the role of the pastor. He uses that image. The state has taken over the role of the pastor. And what the state is doing, it is not so much, about free speech, but it is doing everything it can. And it's not only the state, but it's also all the institutions, I call them their enablers or their partners, are doing everything to make sure that we only say what they deem to be true. So that we are infused with information that those people who have interest in that at that time, whoever is the one in power at that time, is actually those who want their version of what is truth to be held by everybody. And I will take that a step further, because we have become so arrogant as a society. This was the first time I started doubting the whole narrative in March 2020, is when I saw that governments were starting to use war language. We're in a war against a virus, and we're going to defeat the virus, and this and that. This sort of really martial language was being used, and then our society immediately started throwing all sorts of technocratic measures at the situation without really pausing and thinking, wait a second, what is happening here? Isn't it a bit strange that our society that claims that it basically is the master over life and death, with all its technological advances, with all its scientific advances, and everything you can think of, that we completely get deregulated if a small unknown virus that carries certain dangers in it comes into our society, and we get in panic and we just slam on it with a huge hammer without really thinking. Together with what I just quoted from this writer, this brings me to the point that we have become so focused on having to solve any problem in society with this hammer of a technocratic answer, because we do not believe anymore there can be something else. We do not accept anymore that we are not masters over life and death. We do not accept anymore that there might not immediately be an answer of humanity to a certain problem that we have. And prolonged from that is censorship, because basically what the real scientist does is the real scientist always questions. And when we stop questioning, it means it becomes ideology. And what censorship does is it wants to kill that opportunity to actually question this purely technocratic approach. We can do anything. It's interesting. We are now living in Austria here through the biggest catastrophe of a storm in 100 years. We have enormous floodings, and I mean, trains have not been running. I mean, it's just, for 100 years, it hasn't rained so much. And it was very interesting for me to see the response of the authorities. On the one hand, the fantastic response of the men and women in uniform that are working day and night to build dams, etc. But on the other hand, the way some politicians respond, also in other countries, it's immediately, again, this martial language. We have to combat the water, we have to combat the storm. Sorry, guys, you can't combat the water. We can take measures to try to protect the civilians as much as possible and to limit the damage. We can't combat the water. We can't. It's the force of nature. We can't combat the force of nature. What we have to do as human beings is accept the reality of nature, how painful it is, and find ways how we can better understand it and deal with it. All this has become lost in our technocratic society and in our society that rejects any sense of transcendency. It has all gotten lost because the only thing we have left is our own measures, our own hammer. And we just hammer with that hammer as long as we think that it's going to bring something, and that makes us blind. But everybody who cries out and says, stop with the hammer, is, of course, a threat, to that narrative that we can solve everything. And that's where you come to censorship as well. Sorry, I'm taking so long, but I just wanted to...
No, I think that's very important. The reason why it's important is that if you want to undo this censorship apparatus, which I believe is corrosive to the well-functioning society, the deeper roots of it are very, very important. It's not simply just a legal thing where you go after the legal structures by lawsuits or maybe try to get the politicians on your side. You might have thought, I thought, at least I hoped, that after the pandemic was done, that the government would break the wand of its censorship powers, like a wizard saying, I'm done with this wizardry, I'm going to put this away because I don't need it anymore. But if you're right, Christiaan, that is not going to happen. In fact, now that it's become clear that so much of society accepts the censorship as good and right and just, we're gonna be facing this for a long time. And the question is, how do we oppose it?
And you know why? Because we are here criticizing the state or the social media companies who go along with it. But at the end of the day, we ourselves are responsible for that, because we as general population citizens, we have become so infantile. We have become so infantile that we expect the state to solve all our problems, that we're not willing anymore to take responsibility for life. We expect the state immediately to intervene and immediately to take over responsibility from us. And that's because we've become lazy. We have stopped thinking for ourselves. And then obviously, and not all the people who are involved in that, I would say the majority of them, they don't have any evil intentions. They really think that they are doing the right thing. And let's be honest, by far and large, the biggest part of the population in all our countries was actually cheering on all these measures, because people felt safe from it and decided not to think anymore, which is throughout history the biggest problem for when injustice happens, is that when people decide not to think. So most people decided not to think because somehow, the state was going to solve our problems. And so we really have ourselves to blame for this, because we are always looking for the comfortable life and not trying to really take responsibility and push further to say, how can we do this better?
Yeah, I think then in that case, what's needed is an education program, like a program to give people tools to let them know that they do have autonomy, that they're gifted with brains that can assess what the governments are telling them, and that the use of those brains will make societies and even governments themselves, and of course the people, much better off.
That's what it means, government for the people and by the people. It means that the people are actively involved, and that they really make use of their abilities to also be a correction. For example, I was very impressed here in Austria during a certain time of the pandemic. There were many protests on the streets. I was never myself part of those protests, but I saw it on television, and I was very impressed because I hadn't expected that from a country like Austria, for people to actually go on the streets. And these were very peaceful protests where people were actually protesting against certain of the measures. And that's just one example where people took responsibility and said, here, that's what democracy means, is that we actively engage with our political leaders, with our institutions, that we make use of the institutions that are there to actually push back in a peaceful manner when things go wrong. And sometimes I just think, are people sleeping? What's happening?
Well, Christiaan, I want to thank you for joining me on this podcast and sharing your experiences. I think if we're going to make progress, we need to have more conversations like this and let people know. I mean, I think you're right. Once people understand what I think what has happened, that we have acquiesced in this, we as the citizenry have acquiesced in this sort of the sort of giving the government powers it ought never have had. Those powers will start to get taken away, and not before that. It won't be top down legal action. It'll be people waking up and saying, no, we really do want to be able to say our minds, to speak our minds without fear or favor. We don't want to live in a society that allows the government to say, true ideas are false just because it's inconvenient for the government.
Well, in fact, just to add a quick note to that, there was, I read this, I think last year, there was a research done about emergency powers that governments had obtained in times of crisis, and how long those emergency powers or laws stayed on the books. And they actually found out that it takes decades for such emergency powers to be taken away, or even many of them never taken away at all. Yeah. And I think this shows this shows a very human tendency that if you have power, you don't want to give it away, And I think there's a lot more critical assessment needed there. To actually make sure that such emergency powers are taken away again, because they're not there for the long term.
Well, thank you, Christiaan, for talking with me. Until next time, this has been Professor Jay Bhattacharya on the Illusion of Consensus podcast. Thank you for listening.